So you've gone and signed up for an account on Mastodon, PixelFed, or PeerTube on one of the many public servers out there. And you're interested, you had a good time, you've decided to start an instance. Maybe you want to do your bit to maintain the Fediverse. Maybe you want to have control over your social media presence from this point out. Maybe you just want to experiment and play around. When you're at this point, you now have to decide what you're going to put your new instance on. And for many people, this means making the decision between going with a VPS or a managed hosting service. FediHost is a managed hosting service, but we would rather be honest with you than end up with people signing up for our service and feeling like they were tricked. So I'm going to do as neutral and honest a job as I can to outline the pros and cons of VPSs and managed hosting, because the truth is that VPSs are the right choice for certain people. So right up front, and this might be all that most people need to hear, generally, managed hosting is a solid option for people who have less technical experience and would rather pay more money to spend less time figuring things out and maintaining an instance themselves. A VPS is a good option if you enjoy technology, have experience programming or managing servers, or want to deeply understand the nature of the Fediverse and its software. Those guidelines are a traditional understanding of a VPS versus managed hosting decision, but even in the Fediverse, they're still true most of the time. So let's break it down. A VPS is when you pay for a fraction of a server sitting on a rack in a data center somewhere. It's a bit like having an apartment that you rent in a building. You have your own cordoned off little space where you can mostly do what you like within reason, as long as you pay the rent and don't break the law. You can install a Fediverse service. You could save some files there. You could run your own website. But it's your apartment though, so keeping it in order and clean is your responsibility. Managed hosting, on the other hand, is when someone installs and runs the software on a server for you. They're managing it. It's a little bit more like having a hotel room. You're paying for a specific service to be installed and run for you by a professional. The hotel is not as flexible as an apartment, but you don't have to worry as much about cleaning it and keeping it in order. Someone is keeping an eye on things for you. So let's get into some specifics comparing the two. Firstly, looking at resources. With a VPS provider, you're going to be responsible for choosing the correct size server for your needs. Often the services don't want to tell you exactly what to use because it's going to depend on how heavily you use the service. This is okay though. Most of the VPS providers will let you alter the plan and upgrade the number of CPU cores and the RAM if you find that you need it. One thing that I find a little annoying about hosting on a VPS is some providers have these very rigid server options. This much memory, this much CPU, this much RAM, and it just kind of each plan increases by 20% on the previous one, all in the same proportions. The problem is that certain services use a lot of memory, and then there's others that use lots of disk space. Services like PeerTube idle with very low memory and CPU usage until they need to encode something, and then they have this absolutely crazy peak. So ideally, you want to look for a VPS provider that gives you some level of control over the three variables of CPU, RAM, and disk space, or you might end up stuck paying for a bunch of something that you never really use, and you could easily end up paying more than the equivalent managed hosting. You'll need to keep an eye on the resource usage as your community grows, or you add more content, because you're probably going to need to upgrade at some point. On managed hosting, you don't have to worry as much about getting the mix exactly right. The plans will be quite well optimized for the use case that your particular software has, but that doesn't always mean that it's perfect for you. Many of the hosting providers still provide quite rigid packages, so if you're an unusual user, you can still run into issues. And I think this is a good time to make the point that managed hosting services vary a lot. Some of them are just a notch above VPS with install scripts and a person whose job it is to keep an eye on how your service is running. Typically though, you'll get a decent amount of automation and management for most of the regular tasks like, updating the software, installing and running backups, etc. Managed hosting services should be keeping an eye on when resources are running low and upgrading you before you have error messages hitting your users. But the feature set and ease of use will vary a lot. There's a big difference between a 5-star hotel and the Budget Inn in Boise, Idaho. They know what they did. Installing your service on a VPS varies massively by the service. You search for and find in the documentation how to install thing, and then off you go, hopefully not encountering too many issues. You'll be installing via command line a bunch of Linux packages, a database, caches, as well as SMTP configuration, SSL certificate installation, and, of course, DNS configuration, so people can actually drop by for a visit. It may sound intimidating, but if you have really good documentation that feeds you every single line, you can find yourself following the instructions like a recipe. I mean, I don't know how flour interacts with oil and sugar, but the cookie recipe I followed the other night still tasted pretty good. With experience, the stuff all gets easier and you can start to get your head around what the lines are actually all doing. But if you're new to this stuff, generally, start with something popular, like Mastodon. It's going to be an easier place to start because you'll have a lot of blog posts, a lot of support documentation, and lots of people to ask for help. Also, if something is popular, VPS providers often create tools and install scripts for popular services to deploy them in some de facto state. For example, if you go to many of the hosting providers, they will have these one-click installs of WordPress, which is a Fediverse-enabled blogging platform. But they're not going to have one-click installs of something that someone threw together at a hackathon the other weekend. Do be careful with this though, because if you are managing an instance of a Fediverse service on a VPS, you're gonna need to understand what's going on at some point. These one-click installs can be really handy to see how someone else did it, usually following best practice. I mean, when you start out learning how to set up servers, you often are following these sorts of instructions that you don't really understand. So I guess a one-click install is the ultimate sudo blah, 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 I just want this to work. But here's the thing, if you're constantly finding yourself being like, whatever, good enough, I don't care, I just want this to work, if you're not enjoying the process of learning, you might be the sort of person who should just go with a managed hosting service. If you're hosting an instance of a Fediverse service, there'll be a day that you really do need to know how this stuff works. And just generally I've found in life that it's hard to learn things that you don't want to do. For managed hosting, this setup step is very much the minimum thing that it does. You should basically just have to fill in some minor details like your email and the password you'd like to use. The most complicated part will be configuring your DNS, which some services will do for you if you buy the domain through them. The DNS configuration is, I mean, it's not easy if you don't have technical skills, but at least it's just one thing. You can rope in some nerdy person you know, they'll help you out, and then it's over. So what are the advantages of using a VPS? The first and biggest advantage with a VPS is control. You can control the exact version of the software being used. You can control overrides to the CSS. You can make and break everything. It's your party, and you can cry because you recursively removed everything in your root directory if you want to. On most VPS providers, you can also choose where your server will be based. This allows you to look around and locate something closer to your user base or complies with your company or country's data protection regulations. Another advantage is experience. The experience of setting up and running a VPS with a service is useful to better understanding the Fediverse. For people who program for a living and want to get familiar with this Fediverse thing, or those who want to go on to become DevOps professionals, running hosting like this is a really common first step for many people into this DevOps programming career. It's not like you have to do it forever. You could try, see if it's easy, if you're enjoying it. That's great. Maybe it's a little hard, but you know, you're learning, and being able to understand the Fediverse seems like a good use of time in this day and age. One of the less clear advantages is actually cost. In most of the tech things I know, a VPS is the clear, cheaper option, but it's actually not so obvious with the Fediverse. A VPS can certainly cost less. First of all, some services are pretty light, and if you already have a VPS, which isn't at full capacity, you might be able to piggyback a Fediverse service over on there. But what we've been finding is that generally, Fediverse services are not at all like a WordPress install where you compile 100 low-traffic websites on one VPS. Most of the services interact with the ActivityPub protocol in this kind of constant way, listening and caching and pushing, they certainly consume more resources than I ever had lying around on a VPS. You're probably better spinning up a separate VPS and keeping your Fediverse service over there. The other question with cost is optimization. Managed hosting services don't just take your hosting and apply a markup and then sell it to you. They also optimize. For example, PeerTube is quite expensive to host on a VPS because your VPS has to be capable of re-encoding 4K videos, which your users may upload, but most smaller PeerTube instances aren't uploading a video every hour. So you're usually paying for resources that you're simply not using. But if you use FediHost, we do the encoding for you on a specialty server. So you're not having to pay for a powerful CPU that is 95% of the time just serving up a website. The economy of scale makes our entry-level plans really great value. VPSs are one of those things that really pays off once it gets to a larger scale. Once you're attaching object storage and balancing databases and encoding videos all the time, that's when you start saving yourself the markup that managed hosting providers will be putting on your services. Basically, once you're doing your own optimization, then the managed hosting optimization isn't something that you want to pay for. Managed hosting providers are somewhat of a middleman. If they're good at what they do, they add value. But then they usually will also be adding something to the price. Another one of the more case-by-case areas is backup and recovery. Typically, a VPS provider will have a special option to toggle snapshots and backups for you. Because you have actual access to the server, you can also install tools to run periodic backups in any sort of form that you please. If you're in there making modifications and you break something, hopefully you're paying for snapshots and you can roll back in an emergency. Managed hosting providers, on the other hand, will typically take care of this for you and are responsible for ensuring that you don't have data loss. But make sure that they have a backup policy on this written in their terms of service. If user error causes some data loss on your side, hopefully they can help you out. In the Fediverse, there's also a strong philosophy of being able to take your data with you, so any provider should also offer complete backups that you can take with you and set up elsewhere, hopefully in an automated fashion. And if that's not an option, I wouldn't recommend the service. Then on the advantages side for managed hosting services, the most obvious one is ease and time. I used to do software development, and I cannot tell you how many very late nights I spent thinking just a few more minutes trying to fix some problem with a server. I think so much of this depends on whether you find spending those many hours a year an enjoyable challenge or not. You have to ask yourself, why are you choosing to administer a server? Is that what you want to be spending your free time on? You got to look at the command line and do the old, does this spark joy? A lot of the people that I know who are involved in the Fediverse or have hosting with us are really valuable people. A lot of them could be billing their time for hundreds an hour easily. Do they want to spend their Saturday working on fixing a server glitch? Or should they just do an extra hour of their regular day job and pay someone else to deal with that? If you're fairly new to this stuff, this could take quite a lot of time. Make sure that you're not choosing to spend that time doing something you don't really want to be doing to save like $50. I really think that people should do things that make them happy. And as the Fediverse grows, a lot of people that are going to be showing up are there for the whole new social media thing, not running a server. The other thing is the maintenance. All of these active Fediverse projects and their dependencies are being updated regularly. If you are running a server, you will need to be there periodically to make sure that it is patched. Sometimes this will have to be done quite urgently because there will be a bug or a security vulnerability. And this is probably a good time to mention that your own goal for the size of a server matters a lot. If it's just you on a solo instance and you're really only accountable to yourself, you're the boss and you don't have to put that social obligation and stress on yourself. But maintenance is one of these things that does get stressful if you have other people relying on you to be a good steward of their social media presence. When you've got people asking you why this alert is popping up telling them the server is out of date or telling you that their messages aren't going through, it's a lot of stress. For me, this decision is actually quite personally interesting because of that experience I had being a programmer. I look back at that time and realize now that I never really enjoyed it very much, and subsequently, I was never really very good at it. It's this kind of two sides of the same coin thing, you know? When you really love something, you get into it and you do it all the time, and you get better at it than other people. I think the VPS versus managed hosting decision seems like it's quite technical, but it's actually one of these personal things. For most people, they need to think about what they enjoy doing with their time. If you've actually never tried to work on a command line and manage a server, but you're technologically inclined, then actually I'd say it's a great idea to give it a go with a solo instance. Don't put too much pressure on yourself and see if you take to it like a duck to water. You might find, though, that you're a bit more like me. You really enjoy creating stuff, organizing a community. And for me, I knew a guy who was really good at server things, and that guy and I started FittyHost. So he's out there running the server that you might be watching this video on, so that I can focus on making this video. An arrangement that really does make us both a lot happier. And you're very welcome to use our services if you want, or try your hand at a VPS. Honestly, we're just really glad that you're joining us on the Fediverse.